Hobbs, so excited to have you, brother. My neighbor Antonio's like, hey, have you seen this Instagram account? He's doing some incredible stuff. So I wanted to reach out, get with you, and share your story because you're able to embrace social media in a way that's really cool in educating on regenerative agriculture and how that ties into everything. So if you don't care, give us a little quick intro into who you are, and we'll dive into regenerative agriculture and utilizing social media.
No worries. My name's Hobbs Magaret. I was born in the panhandle of Texas in a single wide trailer on a feedlot, and and then was somehow managed to end up in Eugene, Oregon at the University of Oregon for school, where I got a degree in political science, and ended up staying in Oregon for 15 years, where I mostly, for much of my 20s, played guitar and smoked weed and wasted a lot of time, but found my way back into agriculture when my wife got pregnant with our first kid, and I just kind of had to figure out something to do. And during college, I had gone back to the Panhandle and I'd rode colts and done the traditional ranching thing. So I was born in that environment. I grew up in that environment, and I was steeped in that environment until I basically became a hippie for 7-8 years of my 20s. Then got back into agriculture, and when I got into it, the first thing I wanted to do was to find a job, find a well-paying or reasonably well-paying ranching job. So I started interviewing with all these ranches all over the country and found everybody's guru, found everybody's book, everybody's podcast, everybody's TED Talk. And so I started consuming all of this information, and suddenly this new way of visualizing how basically the source code or the operating system of planet Earth began to crystallize in my mind. And I began to realize that the way that I wanted to operate and the way I wanted to contribute was not available in sort of an occupation way. There weren't people out there hiring high density graziers. The big turning point for me was when I got a hold of a book called Man, Cattle, and Veld by Johann Zietsman. I had read Savory's book, Holistic Management. I'd read Gabe Brown's book. I'd read some Garish. I'd read lots of Salatin. I even ordered Salatin's DVD collection at that time. So I've been reading everybody, but then when I got a hold of Man, Cattle, and Veld by Johann Zietsman, who was a Zimbabwean grazier, everything sort of opened up for me. And so he kind of pioneered ultra high density grazing on what he called the veld, or pasture land in Africa. And the way that he basically tore apart ranching and reconstructed it from first principles was just very, very inspiring to me. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do. Now, basically nobody in the ranching industry knew who Johann Zietsman was. And I was just very, very fortunate to stumble upon his work. And so knowing that nobody knew who he was, definitely there were nobody employing his practices. So I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and just try to kick this thing off on my own. So where we were in Oregon, it was a pretty wealthy little community of retirement folks. So there were a lot of people who had unused land that weren't really doing anything with it. So I figured that I was just going to come up with a few head of cattle, and then I was going to graze them in this extremely strange ultra high density way, moving them, 4 times a day in very conspicuous locations, right? So that's what I did. And it started getting people's attention, and people said, hey, how do I get involved in this? How can I invest? How can I, because people talk to you about it, you start to share your perspective. They've never heard it before. They start to believe in it. They start to think, hey, this is some pretty cool stuff, hey, I'm rich, I'm retired, I want to be involved with cool stuff. What else am I going to do at this point in my life? So I had some really cool people who got behind me when I was still in Oregon. And, I realized very early on, and this ties into the social media aspect, that if you have a little bit of money and you have some land. So, because I started out with a little bit of money, no land, no cows. So it was kind of I had a basket full of lemons, right? And most people would say, if you have a basket full of lemons, you should make lemonade. But that's actually wrong. What you should do if you have a basket full of lemons is learn how to juggle. Because if you make lemonade, then you have no supply left. So you learn how to juggle. People pay you to juggle, and then you can buy lemons until you have the ability to make lemonade. So I discovered very, very early on that the only way I was going to be able to grow in this industry was by treating it as, number one, treating it as a performance art and doing it in such a way that was highly conspicuous. And then number two, by adopting a perspective that nobody else had. And so my perspective that I kind of landed on within the first year of doing this was that I do not care whatsoever, and put an asterisk next to this when you think of it, but I do not care whatsoever about the beef product. I don't allow that to enter my mind whatsoever, because that's not what cows are for. Cows exist as living creatures to perform an ecological function. That's why they exist as living creatures. All creatures have a job when they're alive and when they're dead. When you're dead, the job is pretty easy. That's to be eaten. We all are going to get eaten when we die. So why would I treat that as the fundamental philosophical framework of my management? That just doesn't make sense. The job that we all do when we're alive is to perform an ecological function. Now, humanity has certainly gotten away from that, and the vast majority of humanity exists with a large disconnect from the ecology, and the regenerative movement is slowly starting to change that. But as I said, I went in it from the very beginning, just say, I don't care about the beef. If I create and if I manage my cattle in concert, in harmony with the ecology, and I choose my genetic selection such that the animals that I proliferate are the ones that are most able to induce harmony in their environment, then I will get on the back end a superior meat product. If it's the animal that exists in most harmony with its environment is by definition going to be the healthiest. So I don't care about carcass data. I don't care about marbling. I don't care about all of that. That'll come out and take care of itself naturally on the back end. The analogy I like to use is like hitting a golf ball. You can either try to hit it as far as you can, or you can work on your technique. And over time, the person who works on their technique is going to hit the ball farther anyway. So if our goal is to create a healthy food and an enjoyable eating experience, I think in the long run, we have to start with, most people might say get back to basics, but the actual journey to getting back to basics, you have to tear off a lot of layers of indoctrination, of false assumptions, and that's quite a journey to do that. And I was able to kind of commence that journey during 2020 when the pandemic hit. So I started making TikTok videos and sort of blew up on TikTok pretty quick. In that time in 2020, there was only basically 3 graziers doing what I did. And one thing I do want to add is that so I was born basically into the ranching community. So I was born a rancher. And then when my daughter was born and I decided to get back into ranching, I sort of was reborn as a grazier. So that's kind of the transition that happened. So in 2020, I started making TikTok videos. That blew up. And essentially, I found myself in a position where I was being peer reviewed by the entire the entire base of people who were watching my videos. So, you go on there, you make a video, it gets, say, 50,000 views, you're going to get 100 comments, and you're going to get a lot of terrible things said to you, a lot of supportive things, a lot of constructive criticism, a lot of constructive encouragement. And so through that process, I was able to sort of stress test my ideas over the course of the next 3 or 4 years against the perspectives of a lot of people. So like if you go to university, you only have the ability to be sort of peer reviewed by a few professors with, a few perspectives. But this way, I'm sort of being peer reviewed by the world. And so the real value in social media for me, because I have it sort of a naturally sort of intellectual, philosophical bent towards these things. And as I said earlier, I'm trying to suss out the source code of reality. And so putting all of my ideas out there and being willing to absorb whatever comes back has created, in my view, a much more resilient, a much more congruent, reasonable, internally consistent way of looking at grazing. And so that's where we are now. We have since moved to Deep East Texas, and we are currently down here going through some big transitions at the moment, and so we'll probably be somewhere else in the next year. But it's a very dynamic period in my life, and we have some cool stuff going on. And right now, one of the things that I'm doing I spend most of my time doing at the moment, is actually consulting, and that's going really well. And right now, we're at a fascinating inflection point with the election and the focus that we're now putting on the health of foods and our soil, and the advisory council that we're building in the government. And so it's a very exciting time to be alive, exciting time to be in ranching. And I don't think that there's a more exciting time that's ever existed when it comes to ranching and grazing and food systems, and the opportunity to reformulate our relationship with the land, with each other, and with reality at large. I think is just it's a golden moment for that.
I've got to agree with you on that, brother. I am so excited for the future and the potential of what's going on. So you threw a lot at me right there. So
you said a brief introduction. Yeah. I just kind of went with it. Sorry about that.
It's all good. So thinking, the environment of Oregon versus deep South Texas, that's substantially different, right? So would you be like in the Chihuahuan Desert technically?
No, I'm actually in behind the pine curtain. I'm in deep East Texas, where it's like 50 inches of rain a year. No, it's all good. It's probably more similar to your environment, just hotter.
Yeah.
And it's the big transition has been moving to obviously the heat has been a big transition, and the low quality of forage has been a big transition. As you go down in latitude and down in elevation, you get lower quality forages. So the forages we're dealing with down here are very, very low quality compared to what we were getting up in the Oregon high desert.
So how do you view the ecosystem? How do you view the ecology based off of where you are in context of how that differentiates between, say, Will Harris at White Oak, or Gabe up in North Dakota, or Joel in Virginia? How do you gauge where you are? Because I feel like all of those are substantially different ways of, first principle is probably similar, but different ways in how you approach those things. What's your strategy for consulting depending on geography?
Well, when it comes to looking at the differences between those areas, I think the handy thing to do at first is to look at the similarities. And I'm a very, regardless of where you are on the planet, I believe that we live in a grazing ecology. Terrestrially, we live in a grazing ecology. If the grass and ruminants, proto-ruminants, grass-eating animals sort of came on the stage at the same time, and the grass does not function properly without a grazing animal, and the ecology doesn't function properly without groups of grazing animals bunched up and migrating across, basically pulsing the land and distributing energy in an optimized fashion. Now, we've basically had a poorly optimized system for the last 13,000 years, but we can get into that a little bit later. But the fundamental idea there is that you need herds of animals grouped up and moving across the land. So then you get into, okay, so you can say that everything benefits from groups of animals bunched up and moving across the land. And then the question then becomes, how do you optimize that system? Then it just becomes a function of your rest periods and your genetic adaptation, So that's really key. I think Will Harris at White Oaks Pastures, I think he's a good example. I have disagreements about just the ins and outs of how you actually graze. Gabe Brown, Will Harris. Those guys both are more on the savory kind of take half, leave half, or take a third, trample a third, leave a third kind of school. I think Joel Salatin is actually now really getting into some non-selective grazing and beginning to, I've heard through the grapevine, kind of experiment with that. And that's one of the fundamental differences. That's one of the fundamental things that I really enjoy about Johann Zietzmann's work. He's like, look, I'm from Africa. I know how how herd animals actually look on the Serengeti or the savannah. They take everything, and then they move on. And then you get really great, nice, fresh regrowth. So that's kind of the foundation for that. So the how I view it in context is just simply, how long is our rest period going to be? And how are we going to select our animals properly? And so going back to look at things from first principles perspectives, which is that cattle exist primarily as an ecological maintainer. I ask myself, how do we orient our genetics properly? That's one of the first questions that I can ask, and I can tell you one of the big problems. One of the big things that all three of those guys are not willing to let go of is they want a larger framed animal. They want a larger framed animal because they want to be able to deliver to their customer a certain size of cut. They want to deliver to the abattoir a certain size of animal. Emerson said, God's will not be made manifest by cowards, and not to say any of those are cowards, but what I'm saying is that I am willing to go so far down the rabbit hole of ecological maintenance that I can tell the story to my customers that this is what you're going to get because this is what's best for the land, and it's going to be healthiest for you because it's best for the land. That means maybe your steaks are going to be a little bit smaller because I go for shorter and heavier cattle, but this is what the planet needs. And if we all, adhered to these ideas, we would have far more beef than we basically have today, and that we would know than what we know what to do with. So ultimately, one of the things that I'm seeing, particularly in the American Southeast, and this has actually been echoed by Zietzmann himself, is that the American Southeast has the least adapted cattle on the entire planet. So the American, the Angus war machine controls the marketing so heavily throughout the North America that people across the American Southeast are trying to raise animals that are sometimes in whole, sometimes in part, animals that were developed in the northern British Isles, in Aberdeen, Scotland. The record high temperature of all time in Aberdeen, Scotland is 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we take these Scottish cattle and we're like, I'm going to do Black Angus in Louisiana or Deep East Texas or whatever, and it's just totally insane. So one of the things that we look at in terms of the context, or I would advise in terms of the context, and I advise this to all of my the people that I consult with, all my clients, from Spain to the United States to Australia, is you gotta get adventurous with your genetics. And typically what that means is you got to start using unimproved genetics. Unimproved genetics are basically genetics that have not been screwed with by humans over the last 60 years with the feedlot in mind. So really in practice, what that means is you're going to have to be going to getting African genetics in your cattle. So there are some really great breeds out there. Like Moshona is probably the most superior breed for the American Southeast. There's an incredibly good herd in Crescent City, Florida. That's probably the most important herd in the Southeast, in my opinion. They outperform South Pole because they're basically what you would get if you dropped an Angus in Africa for 1,000 years and then came back and saw who survived and how they changed. They're basically a slick-haired, small-framed Angus cow, and they're just incredible with parasite disease resistance. They're incredibly docile, really great. Because in Africa, if they had to krail the cattle at night. You have to go out, graze, come back. And if you were a butthead and couldn't get back to the krail, or you jumped out at night, a lion would eat you. So they self-selected for docility over time. And sometimes during drought periods, they would have to go out, 2-3 hours for grazing and then come back at night. So they'd only get 5-6 hours of grazing when typically cattle need 8. So they'd go through these periods of aggravated selection. And what you end up with are some really incredibly good, hardy, basically no help needed cattle. And that's what we need to really build that harmony with the ecology. And so the first thing I would do when it comes to looking at your context of your environment is looking at your genetics, because whether you're using old school big pasture set stocking, or you're doing ultra high density, non-selective, moving 4 times a day grazing, you're going to get benefits from selecting genetics properly. And then it just becomes a notion of how you want to graze. Do you want to get fully into the ultra high density non-selective, which is the most superior way to graze, but it's the most high variance way to graze. And what I mean by that is you can get the most benefit from it, but if you do it poorly, you can cause a lot of damage. So there are definitely some benefits to the take half, leave half, the take a third, trample a third, leave a third, in that it's a much lower variance undertaking, and you won't cause as much damage, but you won't create as many proactive ecological outcomes on the long term. So when it comes to context, those are the two things you got to look at. You got to look at your genetics, and you got to look at how you want to graze. And ultimately, if you're the kind of person who is an autodidact, if you're willing to teach yourself and if you're willing to experiment with a few things, you will figure it out. You will definitely figure it out. One thing I will say is that I learned the hard way that going straight from traditional ways of grazing and then going super hardcore into kicking out all of the inputs is definitely going to be a rough transition, because most of the cattle that most of the practitioners don't know how to create that balance. I certainly didn't when I began, and most of the cattle that we have to select from today don't have the hardiness or the genetic fitness to be able to handle the pressure that we put on them. So I hope that answers your question about the context of how we change things. For instance, I'll just leave it at that and let you move on with another question.
No, I'll have a follow up that'll go right in with there. So, a lot of this kind of echoes what some of my friends kind of preach. So, like Jake Walke in Australia is doing this with Nguni, which is very similar to like the Mashona you mentioned. And so, for us here in the Southeast, I would think a couple breeds that just kind of come to mind, that curious your take on it, would be like South Pole, Corriente, Piney Woods. I feel like there are some breeds that don't get enough attention, but the pushback with everything, with maybe the exception of South Pole, is that if you had to go to sell barn, they're not going to bring the same numbers, right? And so how do you think that we can bridge some of that gap? Maybe profitability is still the same or better on more animals that are smaller, but what do we do to kind of bridge that gap for farmers or grazers that want to make that change, but they're scared of the breed differences based on the current model?
Well, what you're talking about is assuaging fear, and fear can never be assuaged from the outside. It can only be mitigated from the inside through education. So, as you said, you can say, hey, here are the numbers. If you have if you have more smaller framed animals, you're going to make the same profitability. If you have animals that have better genetics, you're going to be able to spend less money on inputs. If you have And right now, if you have animals that are just better for the environment and better for your health, obviously you're going to be able to bring more through direct to consumer sales. So, there has to be a cultural shift, which I think is happening right now. I think it's a good time for it. We have to create more direct to consumer, and we have to create that pipeline. I think the convergence point you mentioned earlier, that regional food systems or local food systems is what I'll characterize it as the convergence point of many of the systemic ills that our society faces today, and also the systemic opportunities. And I think, in my experience, the biggest thing that we can do, basically in terms of stimulating that the local food sources, is encourage more local and regional abattoirs, slaughterhouses. I think if we had more, basically 10 to 30 head a day abattoirs, and they were profitable and the regulations weren't just totally killing them all the time, I think that more people would find it easier to get into that business. And I think, as I said, the cultural zeitgeist is shifting now, where people are looking for local foods, and certainly that's going to drive that demand. I mean, there are a lot of predictions that we're going to see, many billions of dollars increase in the desire for regenerative foods over the next decade. And I from what I can tell, that seems to be correct. You mentioned Coriene. The breed that I've been working on here in Deep East Texas, we've liquidated our herd, and we didn't just liquidate it. We found a really great guy who's a friend of mine, named Joel in northeast Oklahoma. I'll definitely put you in contact with him. He's a very, very interesting libertarian character with some really interesting funding models on his farm, and he's actually probably not too far from you if you're looking for more source. But he grazes the same way as I do, and he has a very similar outlook. So he has all the cattle, but the point I was making is that I was running Coriene cows and with Mashona bulls on them. So eventually the goal is keep breeding back to those Mashona so that we could fix some of the problems with the Coriene. Now he has a bunch of piney woods, which it appears in this environment are superior to the Coriene. And also I would say South Pole. The problem with the South Pole is that Teddy Gentry did not select for fertility when he created the foundation herds. They didn't select for early maturation, fertility, because using the phrase convergence point, that's kind of one of my pet phrases. Fertility is the convergence point, and you select by taking the mothers that in really tough environments like the American Southeast that breed at 12 to 14 months, calve at 2 and 3 years of age successfully. So that's a demonstration of ecological and genetic fitness. And you take the sons of those cows and then you rank them based on some features that you can learn more about if you read Zietzman's book. And so the South Pole did not do that when they selected for their foundation herd. So that's one of my hangups on South Pole. Coriene, one of the problems there is that they don't fatten well enough, and that's not a beef commentary as much as it is they don't put on, in a high density situation, they struggle compared to the African cattle to put on the necessary bulk to have drought resistant, to have a drought surplus for when drought comes by, to have an effective immune system, because fat is very important in the immune system for cattle, and also for successful cycling and conception. So the African cattle are going to be more naturally fertile simply because they put on more fat when the pickings are good. And that's because they have a higher relative intake. They have a higher intake per animal and per kilogram of body weight. So the Corrieni and the piney woods, particularly the piney woods, even though there are so few of them left, and the South Pole to some degree, if you start using the right bulls, have a lot of opportunity to improve the genetic fitness in the American Southeast. But number one, we got to be bringing in some of those African genetics. The Mashona is both the most widely available and I think probably the best herd that you can get access to in the United States. And then we have to start selecting for fertility, as a rule of thumb, you just you pick those 2 and 3 mamas. You call them the 2+3 cows that they calve at 2 and 3 years of age. They conceive early, which means that they matured early, which means they're much more likely to put on fat than lean meat and water. Lean meat and water, by the way, is what the feed yards want. So by breeding for feed yard efficiency or feed conversion efficiency, we've been creating poorly fertile animals. So basically the entire feedlot industry, which is 80 to 90% of the American beef industry, has been creating mother cows that have to be fed to be fertile. So we got to be selecting those animals that are conceived naturally at 2 and 3 years of age. And then we have to select the shorter and heavier bulls that come out of that. And we have to accept that, especially in the American Southeast, we are going to need shorter and heavier, which is going to mean smaller framed animals in order to maximize our ecological outcomes as well as overall profitability.
So when we're talking about ecosystems, how do you view increasing the diversity? And the reason that I ask that is because when we work with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet, Utah State, what he has found is the phytonutrients, right? All of these health promoting chemicals found in the meat, it is much higher the more diverse. Like he had some in Idaho that was just outrageous, like the best that he had done. And the diversity in the forage is just off the chart. So how does that play into the whole management of the ecosystem, how you view this?
Sure. So one of the other things that Zietzman says, which I really like, is if we fix what's happening above the ground, it'll fix what's happening below the ground. And that's really that's the point where we can fix it. And so one of the things that you have to understand about this ultra high density non-selective grazing is that during the green growing season, we're effectively chasing good grass. So if you imagine in your mind, if you imagine basically a ranch zoomed out and imagine it split into 3 parts. Well, actually for ease, let's just imagine it split into 2 parts. The one part, you are chasing green grass during the growing season. And so basically you're rotating, following that grass that's in the really, really high quality eating stage. And then the other half, you're deferring, which you're not touching at all. And keep in mind that since we're taking basically all of the forage down to the crown, we're rotating more slowly than people who would in a more sort of traditional regenerative rotation. So you're rotating more slowly around the ranch. And in an average year, most people would probably only touch a third of their ranch. So in that other 2/3 to 1/2 of the ranch, what's happening there? It's resting. It's going to seed. It's building soil. It's building root. It's pumping out root exudates. It's building soil organic matter, and it's in that deferred part, what we'll call our stockpile or standing hay, that the diversity begins to really explode. But by giving it that long rest period where you don't touch it, and then once the growing season is over, and say in your environment, it would be probably early November until middle February, maybe late February. During that period, then you're going through that deferred area, and you're strip grazing it and taking it down to the crown. You're working the seeds that have fallen into the soil. You're clearing off everything that is grown, allowing for a revivification of the pasture, and you're providing some protein supplement. So in doing so, we're providing protein supplement instead of hay. The forage is standing there. So instead of feeding hay, we're eating that moribund dead standing forage plus protein supplement. And we've allowed that entire 1/2 to 2/3 of the operation to rest that entire year. And that's what builds the diversity. That's when we're going to see those native grasses start coming in. That's when we're going to see those native legumes start to come in. That's when we're going to see the different species really start to explode. And what we're going to see over the first 2 to 3 years is we're going to see the weed pressure really start to go down, because you're improving the soil, you're improving the humus, the long-lasting or recalcitrant carbon that's in the soil. You're allowing, you obviously know what a root exudate is, right? So it's the stuff that's being kicked out in the soil. Now, young plants have a completely different profile of root exudates than mature plants. And mature fat plants that have not been harassed by grazing animals, they pump out really excellent quality early root exudates and really excellent quality late root exudates. Now, most ranchers, they graze their whole ranch the whole year, and then they feed hay in the winter, right? So what happens is these plants, they never get that opportunity to express the high quality late stage root exudates. And so you're basically allowing more diversity of root exudation, which allows an improvement of the soil, and it improves the percentage of humus in your soil, and that drives the diversity that's in your soil. So, I mean, one of the interesting ways to think of it is that the land is conscious. It is alive. It's waiting for the right combination of factors to occur so that it can go, oh, now we do this, because the seed bank is there. Everybody knows that. The seed bank is there. The seeds that are necessary are there. Plus, there are birds flying around shitting it out all the time anyway. So we're getting those seeds are available, but the seeds and the land have a conversation, and the seeds go, is it safe for me to come out? And the land goes, no, we're getting grazed every year. The whole thing's getting grazed every year. Like it's not a safe time. You're going to come out. They're just going to eat you down. You're one of those really great, like you're probably, let's say that you're like big blue native grass. It pop out if you want, but you're going to get eaten to death, because that's what's been happening on this land. Year 3, year 4, the land says, man, I'm full of late stage exudates. My humus level is it's good condition. So come on out. And so those really biodiverse conditions begin to arise, because you are not putting the land under pain of death every year by giving and giving and giving. You're allowing it to give back. So you allow that the land to do its work unharassed by the animals. And then every other year you switch the sections that are being rested and the sections that are being chased during the green growing season. So one year the area that rested the entire year, then you come back through the next year, and that's your green growing active year. You're getting lots of saliva on the plants. You're getting lots of manure. You're getting tons of urine 10 to 12 times a day per cow with basically fertilized rain, right? And it's every place that a cow pees is about 1.5 inches of rain equivalent, plus, some nitrogen, which is amazing. The original irrigators. So that's one of the reasons why we have a much more biodiverse phytonutrient profile in the meat is because these grazing practices that we're using are allowing the land to express its natural biodiversity. Just stop harassing it and treating it like crap all the time, and boom, it'll do it on its own. And so that's why I talk about proactively driving ecological outcomes. So what we do now is we exist in kind of our land is precious. We have very limited resources. Let's try to preserve those resources and not take too much. And that is the alcohol metaphor for grazing. Like, yeah, I graze, but I'm responsible. I graze, but I don't take too much, But what we need to do is flip that paradigm on its head and think about grazing like exercise. Think about grazing like water. It's like, we are trying to drive proactive ecological outcomes that will result in resource expansion. We're not trying to just preserve what little resources we have, not take too much. We're trying to expand the amount of resources, because that's what it's like regeneration, but also progeneration, because we want things to go back and get better, but we also want to expand. If we have more soil carbon, more biodiversity, more available grass, more cattle can graze on it. And what we're doing there is we're expanding our resource base. So that's one of the fundamental paradigm shifts that has to happen. And if we do that properly, the biodiversity arrives on its own, and we all get better beef for it.
Too cool. Love that. Yeah, you definitely have a different approach, right, than what you kind of see in that standard regen grazing concept. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. So what are your thoughts on kind of the multi-species? Are you incorporating some of the other maybe smaller ruminants or monogastrics, whether that's pork or chicken, and how do you view that as part of this ecosystem?
Hey, I'm all for it. I don't know anything about sheep or goats. I've had some chickens in my life. I don't know anything about pigs. I have no problem with people who can do that. I think one of the problems is every species that you adds a level of complexity to your operation, and a lot of times complexity is not the answer. So a lot of times it's just optimizing optimizing a simplified operation is better than adding complexity and expecting things to get better. That being said, I've never done it personally, so I hesitate to have any real convictions about it. What I will say is that grazing with just one species really effectively increases multi-species grazing because it attracts wildlife. You get more diversity of large animals and you get more diversity of small animals. You get more birds, and you have, one of the things I was seeing in Oregon is that the ravens would start to follow behind. People would say, do you have chickens that you follow behind the cattle? And I was like, no, the ravens do it. The ravens dig through the poop and pull out the larvae and do all that stuff. So, I have no problem whatsoever with people who want to do multi-species. One of the problems with multi-species is that in addition to adding some complexity that most people may not be foreseeing or be prepared for, it also prevents the density at which you can graze. And one of the reasons that we want to really maximize that density is if you imagine a massive herd in the savanna. Now you will see some multi-species on the savanna. You'll see zebra and wildebeest and elephants all together. But one of the things is by the time that huge herd has passed, and they will be segmented, so that they can increase the density. You won't see a zebra and a wildebeest every other animal. They'll be split into kind of their groups. But by the time that whole massive herd has moved across the landscape, the amount of impact on that land. Let's say you have 10,000 animals moving across the landscape on African Serengeti. The impact on that land is massive, and we can't replicate that impact with say 100 to 200 animals unless we increase the density and we keep them in one area for say 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever. So once you really massively increase that density to the level that, some people are able to do, Gabe Brown gets 1 million plus pounds per acre. Zeetzman gets 1 million plus pounds per acre in Africa. I don't think, Joel Salatin or Will Harris historically has gone up to that high. Maybe they have, and I don't have that information right. But what we'll see is that if you try to throw sheep into the mix, the sheep will just get kicked out by the cattle and they won't have the ability to graze. So in order to maximize those densities and to create those really good ecological outcomes as a result of sort of our proactive management, it makes it kind of difficult the way I do it to incorporate other species. Now, is my way the be all end all? I'm sure it's not. One of the things my dad likes to say is every 50 years we find out that 50% of the stuff we thought was true was wrong. So I'm sure that over my career, I will be finding out that a lot of the things that I think are true are wrong, and excellent. Every time we find out we're wrong, we're learning and we're improving. So that's great. I could be wrong. It could be that multi-species grazing is the way of the future, and I just am not smart enough to understand how that's the case. But long story short, I just don't have a whole lot of experience with it. And plus, I love cattle.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great take. So let's shift gears just a little bit on the farmer side. So where are the biggest challenges at the end of the ag part of the food system? Okay, so like for the farmer moving their end product, it's like the easiest way is you run through a cell barn, right? But that might not be the most profitable way, or maybe it is the most efficient way. What do you see as the biggest challenge for once an animal's raised and ready to leave the farm, doing that in a way that just kind of works for everybody in the context of this system?
Yeah, so marketing is obviously a difficult one for many people, especially farmers and ranchers. They don't like marketing. I'm sure you've had this conversation 1,000 times with 1,000 people. And ultimately, we have to, let me back up. There are a lot of people coming into the regenerative world right now who have no desire to farm or ranch, and they're trying to find a place in the regenerative ecosystem to be able to contribute. And a lot of times they're trying to figure out financing mechanisms. They're trying to figure out how they can contribute in other ways. And what we need are really effective aggregators. And, we've seen some of those. There's one that's kind of in your area. I mean, you are one, right? You're an aggregator. So we need more effective aggregators. And in order to do that, we have got to, we've got to remove the regulations. We've got to, or make the regulations smarter for slaughterhouses. If you can, and one of the things that I want to effectively, I want to back up and say is that if we can align our systems with the quality of life of the animal, that's really what we need to do. Because if you honestly ask somebody, is the quality of life of a calf or an animal improved by taking it to the sale barn, by going to a backgrounder, by going to a feedlot? Is the quality of that animal's life improved? Absolutely not. So how can we create these systems that are in line with the quality of life of the animal? Maybe we have aggregators that are committed to the quality of life of the animal. And I know there are a lot of certifications out there and a lot of people who are doing it, but we need to get better at that. And that's going to come with that cultural shift and more people trying to get regenerative products. I think one of the things that we have to focus on in getting here's one thing that was great when we did this branding exercise when I started my fire and salt business with this guy. Oh my gosh, I'm having a hard time remembering his name, but I do remember that he was a gay autistic man from Dublin, Ireland. And so he had zero experience with agriculture or regenerative agriculture, so he could see it clearly. And he would go to these websites and he'd say, these people are not talking to me. They're not talking to me as a customer. They're saying either, look at my cute farm and my cute farm family, or they're saying, we're all going to die if we don't switch to regenerative agriculture. None of that is talking about the customer. So as more successful branding and marketing people have gotten into the industry, we've seen that we need to give the customer an easy in that doesn't require them to be educated or feel bad or feel jealous of your cute farm family, right? So that's why we named our business Fire and Salt, because we just want to give people an emotional in to what it is that we're doing. It's just simply about, reconnecting. It's about giving the customer, what they want. So the regenerative movement has to build connection with the customer. And this is hard. This has been so hard for me to understand because I grew up in the ranching industry and I've had a hard time getting into the shoes of somebody who grew up in a suburban or urban environment. Like to me, seeing animals all the time, seeing the ecology work, seeing how life on the planet basically functions and how the gears of the landscape function and turn and tumble is baked into my to who I am. But if you grow up in a suburban environment and you never see large animals and you don't have that imbued into, if you're not imbued with that, it's hard. You're not going to look at a regenerative website and connect with, here's my cute farm family, or connect with, we have to make the ecology function better. We can connect with what you're doing, which is, here's food that's good and healthy for you and your family, so your life is better, right? So that's where we reach people. And I've struggled with that because I'm obsessed with the ecology. I'm obsessed with creating abundance through ecological harmony. I'm obsessed with creating more life per cubic meter. The average person who is a customer does not care at all about that. And I used to get so frustrated with that, but now I've kind of just sort of become accepting of that reality, and one of the great, I think, tragedies of human civilization at this point is that human beings are fundamentally ecological participants. But if you're living in Inglewood, California, and you have been since you were a little kid and you're 35 now, you have no conception of yourself as an ecological participant outside of the human ecology that you live in, right? And so you don't care where your steak came from. You care that it is healthy and it is going to make you feel better, and it's going to give you more nutrients, and effectively it's going to make you feel better and make you live longer and last longer in bed, right? Like those are the things that people actually care about. So the biggest problem that we have as farmers is connecting with the end consumer and shifting patterns, the drivers of which I think we're still kind of figuring out. We'll have to go a bit farther before more people can kind of come into this game. And that's why, in my view, I really think if I had to pick one thing to change, if I could talk to the Secretary of Agriculture right now and tell them one thing that needs to change, it would have to be, we gotta find a way to encourage more small, local, and regional slaughterhouses. That's the big hang up. That's the big hang up.
No, I think that's a great take. It's my focus being on the retail and marketing side, like I can attest. One of the challenges I see there is that it costs more money, right? It costs more money when you have to have somebody involved that does the marketing and retail, right? So the end consumer gets to pick that price. And so I think a lot of times there's some give and take there that makes it maybe out of the feasibility for a lot of people, but it's also such a crucial part, in my perspective, on the partnerships to build out the entire food system, because there's a convenience, right? So we had just had a big blow up over here in Arkansas on raw milk, right? The health department came in, busted me for selling raw milk for pet consumption. And
damn, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's all good. A lot of goods come out of it, but
I believe that. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing there that was so evident for me is, like, in the state you can buy directly from a farm. There's some guidelines, they limit how much you can produce, but there's no farms that are in the city, right? Like you're having a 3-hour round trip for the most part for most people to go get a gallon of milk, and it's just not feasible. But going to a grocery store where they can get things, like a small market like mine, they have access to it. And so we can partner, and it works out. And I think that is a huge need. I think the slaughterhouse, the abattoirs are so important, but I think we've got to have more of the markets that have a local emphasis, and,
right.
and that bridges these hubs that you're talking to. So, man, Hobbs, I can't thank you enough, man, for taking the time and doing what you do. Tell us a little bit about where we go to find you. Somebody wants to, become a client and work with you on the grazing practices. Where do we find out more?
Sure. So Instagram, you can find me Fire and Salt Beef, at Fire and Salt Beef on Instagram. TikTok, Fire and Salt. Although I will say I don't really check TikTok that much, even though it has been really good to me. I have 250,000 followers on TikTok. But if you want to go somewhere and put yourself out there and get insulted to death, TikTok is a great place. Somehow Instagram does not have that, and I'm just not exactly sure why. You can also email me, hello@fireandsalt.com. And those are pretty much the main avenues. But I would say if you have an Instagram, go ahead and reach out to me on Instagram, and I would be happy to connect with you. Thank you so much again, Logan, for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Anytime you have a captive audience for somebody like me that I can talk to for an hour, I'm about this. And, so much of it is going on in my mind all the time. And I will say also that, just as a quick aside, my book is almost done. So I will have a book coming out this probably late fall, and I'm pretty excited about that. Still working on the title, but it's probably going to be something along the lines of A Tiger in the Garden: The Mind, Body, and Spirit of Grazing. So, basically, the goal of the book is to examine the philosophical value structure that's affecting grazing, how it is currently, and then how we can change that. That'd be the mind of grazing. The body of grazing is the physics, the efficiency, the energy, the mechanics of the actual practice, and then the spirit of grazing. The mythology, the metaphysics. We have so many indigenous cultures that in their mythological foundational stories involve them and a ruminant animal. For everywhere, everything from Siberia to the Blackfoot. It's just everywhere. So when you're looking at the source code of humanity and the environment, herds are indispensable, and without them we get in big trouble. So that's what my book is about, and it should be available. And we're going to have to put up a pre-order link pretty quick. But you can find me on Instagram at Fire and Salt Beef, or email hello@fireandsalt.
Well, congratulations on the book, brother. We'll do whatever we can to help promote it. I'm sure it is going to be fantastic. So thank you again, buddy.
Right on. Hey, it was great talking to you, Logan. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.